Hey there, kids, and welcome. It is time again for Conscious Embodiment, Astrology, and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. Howdy, Zoe, producer Zoe.
Hello. Hello, Michael. Hello, listeners.
Yes, how's the Wormhole eclipse season treating you?
You know what? I'm chilling. I don't know.
You're chilling, all right?
Yeah. Business is good.
Well, and this speaks to something that is true about astrology is that while I talk about the general astrology that we're all bathing in, how each of us dials into the astrology is very different and individual based on your natal chart, right? So I, too, am having a gentler time of this eclipse season. But last time we were in eclipse, I was still in my second Saturn return. There were some other transits that were hitting my chart, right? So just like I think we talked last week about a listener who was pummeled by the Libra full moon, and I was pummeled by the Virgo full moon, but not the Libra full moon. So this is one of those challenges of astrology that
Right, to each their own.
Right. Everybody's going to grab the information differently, which is why I encourage people to learn how to read your natal chart. If at the very least, you figure out enough about how a chart works. So if I say things like, look to the Aries house in your chart, which I'm going to say several times today, then you know what that means. Right? Because that's one of the ways in which we each dial in individually is based on how our charts are set up at the individual level. And, we have a question this week that kind of talks into or speaks into a little bit individual differences that can show up in a natal chart that impact a person's life. So here's the question from Kathy. Have you ever seen two T-squares in one chart? For instance, one T-square release is in Scorpio. I'll explain what that means in a minute. And second, opposite T-square releases is in Taurus. If you've seen this, what does it mean? Well, first of all, of course I've seen this. I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of charts in the 30 years I've been an astrologer. Of course, I've seen this. And I'm not going to speak into your chart, Kathy. I don't have it in front of me. We're not doing a reading. And if you really want details about specific T-squares that fall into your chart, you'll have to sit with an astrologer for them to explain it to you. This is nothing I could do here in the podcast. But it brings up a topic of a question that I've been asked before that I can address in a general way for people who know that they have certain patterns inside their natal charts. So in this particular pattern, Kathy's talking about a T-square. That's like two planets that oppose each other, and then a third one that splits the difference, that divides that opposition up into two separate squares. This is a setup for lots of lessons and conflicts that teach you and help you move through life. So when you have T-squares in your chart, that means you have at least three planets that relate to each other in the 90-degree angle, which is the angle of conflict and obstacle through which we learn. Specifically about squares or T-squares in a chart, I'll say this. It's not a bad thing to have in your chart, though it does indicate that the earlier you are in your life, the more difficult life is, because you're literally being handed some challenging conflict energy that's in your psyche that says, here, you're going to trip on this shit. But if you keep tripping on the same lessons over and over again, you're eventually going to become masterful at whatever these squares are trying to teach you. So a T-square means there are three planets squaring each other that suggests an even greater sense of this person learns through conflict and obstacle. Kathy has two T-squares that sort of oppose each other. I'm going to assume that they're not geometrically aligned to be an actual what's called a grand square, where 4 planets at least square each other, dividing the circle of the chart into 4 equal parts of 90 degrees each. But anybody with lots of squares is going to learn through conflict and obstacle navigation and have an sort of an easier time the older they get, which might be able to be said about any of us. We all get better at being human the older we get.
I was just thinking that.
Right.
Hopefully.
But when there are T-squares in a chart, there's a guarantee that that's going to happen. So hopefully that'll satisfy Kathy a little bit. The rest of your question to be answered, you really need to be in a session with an astrologer to have the specifics about that. But I'll do a little bit of a teaching about patterns in general in a chart, because this is what I want you guys to know and understand about what it means to have any pattern in the chart, whether it's a grand cross, 4 planets in squares, or a grand trine where there's a harmonious triangle, or a kite, or a mystic rectangle, or a finger of God. These are all different shapes that planets can be in at the time of your birth. So, imagine in your mind a perfect rectangle. There's a way that 4 planets can line up in a certain shape that is rectangular that we call a mystic rectangle, right? Where the planets are set up just perfectly enough for the different consciousness that each planet brings to be interacting with the other consciousness that make up the shape in a way that would suggest this person has good efficacy in certain areas based on what planets are making the pattern. But for the sake of the teaching, kids, I just want you to picture a rectangle in your mind. So you're the audience identification. You picturing a rectangle?
I got it.
You got it. Now imagine if you're dinging, like clicking with your finger. You're like, you're sparking a hit to one corner of that triangle.
Mm-hmm.
Just by what you know about sound and frequency, because you're a sound person, would not then, in the perfection of a rectangle, you hit one corner, it's going to vibrate each other corner in that rectangle perfectly.
Right.
Because of the shape. Not unlike what happens to sound in a room that's acoustically well-shaped, the sound vibrates extra. But in a room where the sound, where the acoustics suck, there's not going to be that amplified extra vibration. So it's a little bit like that. So if you have a bunch of planets in your chart shaped in a pattern, like a mystic rectangle or any of the others that you might have heard of or that I just mentioned, it sets up a life where periodically there are going to be bigger moments because a transiting planet's going to hit one corner of that triangle by conjunction and then automatically oppose the opposite point, sextile one of the points, and trine the third or the fourth, whichever one makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that means that there will be passing moments, slow moments when it's an outer planet, faster if it's social, very fast if it's a personal planet swiping by, and every month when the moon swipes by and hits every corner of this rectangle in your chart, that consciousness is activated. So when you find out that you have a pattern, you have an understanding that there are going to be moments in your life that rise up in importance. And if the pattern has squares in its shape, then it's going to be moments of conflict and obstacle that teach. If it's triangles, like a grand trine, it's going to be moments of sort of manifestation movement where flow is so great that things start to manifest and get created. Then if it's another shape, you got to look up what the shape means and sort of apply the same principle to what I'm talking about here. That when planets make shapes in your natal chart, when any transiting planet hits one corner of that shape, the whole shape is lit up. That person has moments in life that are more dramatic and intense than the average bear.
Oh, and by the way, for those who only listen to the podcast or like see you on TikTok, I hope they know that they can book a session with you.
Absolutely. It's so funny. I'm so glad you said that because, I'm not a overt promoter. Like, I don't do this podcast to promote my work. I do this podcast to serve. And I don't do my global healing meditations to, make announcements, although I try to remember to do so. But every once in a while, I'll get asked, do you do reading? And I'm like gobsmacked that you would even ask. Of course I do readings. Of course I do readings. I booked a little bit in advance, and it's not cheap to sit with me. So I'm a good 4 months out. But yes, michaelnx.com, anybody can have a reading. And if you want to ask about your patterns, I'll be happy to talk to you all about that. All right, so it seems sort of silly to call this a quiet week because it's anything but quiet. We're in the middle of the eclipse wormhole, which means we're halfway between the new moon eclipse behind us and the full moon that's hitting next week. And anytime we're in between eclipses, everything is more intense. Passions are more passionate. Grief is more, deep. Joys and exultancy are a little more over the top. Lessons are more tripping up. And the flow is more flowing. While Mercury is quiet this week in terms of making any of the triple transits that will be part of his retrograde cycle, the fact that he's backward moving in the middle of eclipse season is also, dicey. Perhaps more bumpy last week because that's when he turned around and that's when we entered eclipse season. So this week is, air quotes, quieter because Mercury isn't actively turning around in one direction or another, but he's still moving backwards, and we have that to contend with. Venus is in Gemini for most of the month, so our processing of our emotions is still happening in a kind of a mental-ish way. And that's going to make the week and all month dicey too, because there's what's called a mutual reception going on there. Venus in Gemini is in a Mercury-ruled sign. Gemini is ruled by Mercury. Mercury
retrograde
is retrograding in Taurus, a sign ruled by Venus. That's called mutual reception. That just means that the two planets are understanding each other more efficiently and more deeply because each one is in the sign of the other. So with a Mercury retrograde, I'm not sure that that's necessarily good news. I think I'll put it this way. If during this week, you feel like all is well in your mind and your heart. Your communication feels clean and clear. You're understanding your emotional process enough that you're not baffled by it, and you're getting the best of what this retrograde has to offer. This week will afford you some good insight and awareness from the mind that's able to understand what the emotional experience of your current week is, right? So the top of the wheel has anything that happens with Mercury's retrograde bumps that you pass through this week will also give you emotional insight in a way that I think will be valuable and beneficial. Then the bottom of the wheel is because they're in mutual reception, I think that any retrograde-y shenanigans you bump into this week will potentially be more off-putting, more destabilizing, more emotionally challenging. You can just think of mind and heart in a kind of congruency, which is good news, but we're in an unconscious process, which means that if there's anything in the unconscious that's bubbling out of us as we move through this retrograde, some of us are going to be bumping into some emotionally high-stakes interactions this week that might be less smooth than you prefer. I'll just throw in there as the, completion of the personal planet pictures to remind you that Mars is in Cancer still. That's a debilitated sign for Mars, although he's not actively engaged in anything too rough this week. I would say that on Thursday through Friday, Mars is going to square Chiron and sextile Uranus. So that's conflict energy with the healing presence with a little added oomph of wake up possibility with that sextile to Uranus. So as we move through the second half of the week, be aware that we're already challenged in communication land with Mercury backwards, and that portion of this week is where Mars in Cancer might be bringing us through an experience of wounded consciousness that maybe we were hoping we didn't have to address. Mars in Cancer likes to keep things sequestered and pulled back. So watch out for the explosions towards the end of the week if you have, in fact, been holding back something that needs to be expressed that's in the direction of anger or frustration or bother. Mercury's retrograde will potentially inhibit you speaking up. And as we get to the end of the week, Mars in Cancer might make speaking up a necessary act to release some of the pressure that might be in the below spaces as we move through this week. So that's the second part of the week. Let's talk about today and tomorrow, because there's something kind of, well, if nothing else, interesting to talk about with regard to a moment in every eclipse season. Every eclipse has the sun in alignment with one of the nodes of the moon. That's, in fact, the geometry that creates the eclipses is that the sun and the earth are in a particular alignment with regard to this vector of energies that we call the north and south node. And every 6 months, the angular alignment sets us up to have the shadow break the beam of light. So there's a technical aspect of the eclipse that has to do with when the sun and the node in question is in alignment. So just from the geometry of it, today is actually the sort of peak of the idea of a geometry that causes this shadow to break, which in and of itself is just astronomical until we add the archetypal interpretation. So every eclipse season is either going to be a north node eclipse or a south node eclipse, and they alternate. The sun is in alignment with the north node right now, and in 6 months at our next eclipse season, the sun will be at the south node. So north node eclipses are more designed to have us in awareness of where we want to go, as opposed to being in awareness of that which we have to release in order to go forward. That's a south node eclipse. This being a north node eclipse, all of my language as an astrologer in terms of intentions that we set, the releases that we'll move through next week in the full moon lunar eclipse. But if you look at the archetype of it, the sun is our conscious awareness, and the north node is the point that represents where we're heading, where we want to go next. Now, tomorrow, Venus and Chiron are forming a productive sextile. That's a beautiful moment where the heart is open and in the process of healing wounds makes that 60-degree interaction a really productive moment for healing the wounds that we've been working on healing. Then the sun is going to sextile Saturn tomorrow. That means our conscious awareness is working really well with the wisdom and the responsibility guidance planet. So the teacher is in the house tomorrow with our conscious awareness, while Venus is opening up all sorts of healing possibilities with Chiron. So now we add to that the conscious awareness of the sun conjunct the north node sense of future that the entire collective is moving towards. Then this whole first half of the week is about taking a moment to consider where it is you are heading and moving in terms of your forward desires, your sense of North Star, and your dharmic expression, and know that we're also opening the heart and our sense of responsibility to the healings and the lessons of the time, making these couple of days as we start this week really important for taking stock of where you're heading next and express some gratitude about the healing process that you are in that's allowed you to get to a place where you can actually create some things of new, vibrant beauty because you've dropped some wounded, spaces along the way. So it's not only a good assessment moment because Venus is hitting Chiron and Sun is hitting Saturn. These couple of days really will offer some of you important lessons and healing interactions that might show up as conversations with people where there's a little bit of higher stakes in the, intimacy department. Have at this first part of the week for some deep, heartfelt healing, and be aware that at the end of the week, there might be some angry, reactive possibility as we move through a very different sensation towards the end of this week.